What is going on, everybody? Welcome. I am the Soul Carney. Today is officially October, and so that means it's officially time to start getting spooky and goofy. Thought what better way to do that than to go over one of my favorite spooky stories of all time, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was written by Washington Irving and was first published in 1819. This is only 1 year after Mary Shelley published her famous novel Frankenstein. So it was a good time for Gothic literature. Keep in mind throughout this that this story is written less than 50 years after the Revolutionary War and probably takes place less than 30 years after the Revolutionary War. Washington Irving liked to base his characters around real people that he met and even give them names of people he really met. So Ichabod Crane, who is our main protagonist in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was a real army captain that Washington Irving met while in America. I say while in America because he wrote this story on vacation in England. He was from America, but he was on vacation in England, and that's when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And at the time he was doing a tour of Europe, so a lot of the story is probably influenced by German and British folklore, particularly that of the main specter of the story, the Headless Horseman, based on the German DULLAHAN. The story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is grounded in a level of realism that lots of Gothic literature really isn't. Sleepy Hollow was a real place. The Van Tassels were real people. All the locations exist or existed at the time that this story was written. And Sleepy Hollow, unlike lots of other ghost stories, so to speak, isn't a traditional ghost story. It's a story about ghost stories. You'll see what I mean in a second. Let's go through the story. First off, the story itself is beautifully written, and it's very easy to read, even though it is some older styles of writing, some older ways of speaking, things like that. But it is phenomenally easy to read, and just everything is extremely well described, and it's a really beautiful read. It starts off with Washington Irving telling us about the place where it's taking place, Sleepy Hollow, the geography, what it looks like, and he speaks of how quiet and sleepy the place is, and of how superstitious the people of the place are, and how many different kind of ghost stories that they all seem to have. We then learn about Ichabod Crane, who is the schoolmaster from Connecticut, who has come to stay in Sleepy Hollow and teach the children. We're given the description, and he's described as lanky and small head, big ears, big nose, flat head, just a very goofy looking guy. And that's something that's kind of subtly hinted at here, but something that should not be lost on you as you read this is the humor of the story. It's actually quite funny. And for most of the runtime of the story, you're just kind of getting built up the character of Ichabod Crane and what kind of a guy he is and what his wants and desires are. And it's not really a ghost story until the end. It doesn't really get scary until the end either. Until that point, it's kind of just this goofy drama kind of a story like that. And Ichabod himself is also very superstitious, like the people of the town. He knows a great deal about witchcraft, although it scares him. And there's there's an entire section that talks about him like walking home from his schoolhouse at night and just every possible little thing scaring him, like a frog croaking. It describes a snow-covered bush like a phantom, and it says he about gave up the ghost when a beetle buzzed by him. It's quite a funny little section of the story. At this point in the story, we're told that the greatest specter that ever vexed Ichabod Crane is a woman named Katrina Van Tassel. Keeping up with the way Washington Irving likes to write his stories, Katrina Van Tassel was a real person. This one wasn't like someone like Ichabod Crane. Ichabod Crane was a combination of two different people he knew, a schoolmaster and an army captain. Katrina Van Tassel was literally a real 18-year-old girl he had met in America, and is exactly how he describes her in the book. She was just completely a real person he just inserted into his story. We learn that Ichabod has a crush on Katrina Van Tassel, only slightly because he likes her. It's heavily implied that most of the reason he likes her is because of her immense wealth, her father's immense wealth. Her father is a rich farmer named Baltus Van Tassel, who I'm assuming was also a real person. Ichabod becomes rather obsessed with the idea of marrying Katrina whenever he sees for the first time her house and her father's barn, which he describes looks more like a church, and just this massive house that he has and all of this stuff. So our hero is motivated by kind of selfish, greedy motivations. And then we're introduced to Abraham Van Brunt, or Brom Bones, as he is known in Sleepy Hollow. Now, Brom is kind of like the exact opposite of Ichabod, whereas Ichabod is very smart, intelligent, and lanky, and skinny, scrawny, and just goofy looking. Brom is like extremely tall, extremely handsome in the face, just ripped, just kind of a bigger guy, kind of a bully. He's a profoundly good horseback rider. Most of my description actually doesn't come from Washington Irving's story. Rather, that was Walt Disney's interpretation, but it's heavily implied that that's kind of how Brom is within the story itself. Throughout most of the story, we really just see Brom Bones and Ichabod kind of trying to woo over Katrina Van Tassel. The whole story is written very great, and so I would never say that it's just kind of nothing for a while, but I mean, really, there's not a whole lot of significance other than just like character development until Ichabod is invited to the Van Tassel house for a party of sorts. Ichabod decides that it's at this party that he is going to try to woo over Katrina, maybe even propose. Things worked differently back then. You didn't have to date for 7 years before you proposed to your girlfriend. There's a very funny sequence that describes Ichabod's horse that he gets from a guy, and the horse is like half blind and got a big bowed back. Ichabod's got his feet up in the stirrups, and so his knees are like up around him like this, and he's just like got his whip like this, and he's just like he's described as just a very goofy looking sight going up over the hills and stuff. And I don't know, it's just some subtle like cartoonish humor, and I think that's something that Walt Disney's version of this story nailed pretty good. So the Van Tassel's house is not in Sleepy Hollow itself. It's just outside of Sleepy Hollow, possibly in Tarrytown itself, but it's not, I don't know, it doesn't really describe exactly where the house is at. But it's a ways away from where everybody in Sleepy Hollow is at, so everyone has to make quite a journey to the house. And once there, Ichabod begins to try to pursue Katrina, and Brom Bones is doing the same thing. And if I'm remembering the story right, it kind of seems like Ichabod is kind of winning over Katrina, until at one point everyone gathers around at Brom's request, and they start telling ghost stories. It doesn't tell us anything of the stories. It does mention that Brom tells a great, fantastic story about the Headless Horseman, about an encounter he had with the Headless Horseman in which it chased him to this bridge, and once he got across it, he disappeared. And this story really captures Ichabod's imagination and really freaks him out, really. Ichabod's heard of the horseman before several times, but this is the first story he's ever heard of someone having a real encounter with the horseman. The horseman himself is said to be a Hessian soldier who had his head taken off by a cannonball in some nameless battle of the Revolutionary War. Again, keeping in mind this story is written less than 50 years after said war. After the story is told, it kind of cuts to a scene. Ichabod is leaving the house, and he's distraught. And it's just implied that Katrina turned him down. And he gets on his horse, whose name is Gunpowder, and begins to set off back towards Sleepy Hollow. It was a very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards, along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, which he traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker, the stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was moreover approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all other trees in the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising up again into the air. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought this whistle was answered, but it was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. So, basically the story just talks a lot about all these just normal things that happen on a windy night in the autumn time. But every one of them, because Ichabod is so down and depressed about being rejected by Katrina and so just prone to being scared, all the ghost stories here kind of come back to him. We see that, and it says, all the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding around his recollection. So he's just, oh my gosh, all these scary things he's seen throughout the day are now coming back to him, and it's nighttime, and he's not in the safety of a house or of the daylight. This is something that I find actually quite relatable. It's like, it's super easy to watch a horror movie like at 10 o'clock in the morning or like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But then like later on at night when you're laying in bed and you start thinking about it, then it's like, oh man, like why did I watch that movie? So, I mean, this is something that's very relatable. This is written almost, over 200 years ago. So, and I think that this kind of charm that this story has is what has made it so popular and still influential and relevant today, over 200 years later. So after this, Ichabod and his horse kind of go down towards this stream, and Ichabod gets kind of panicky because the horse stops, and he tries to whip it into going, and the horse kind of just jumps to the side of the road and in this kind of thicket of stuff, and Ichabod's freaking out, and he's trying to get the horse back on the road. And that's when things start to get creepy. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster, ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose up upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin? If such it was, what could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning therefore a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he cudgelled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Oh, he's singing. But this is something that it's described that he does whenever he gets scared. And I don't know why I find it funny, but it's just like, he's scared. There's this big shadowy thing that he can't tell what it is, and it's not answering him, so he just kind of, oh my god, like just starts like singing. I don't know. Anyway. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. So Ichabod kind of begins to think of the story that Brom Bones told about his encounter with the Headless Horseman. And he, doesn't like this one bit, because he knows now that this dark thing is actually a guy on a horse who just isn't answering him. And so he moves forward and just kind of walks. He tries to quicken his pace and get away from him, but the man on the horse stays close by him, keep in mind it's extremely dark, so Ichabod can't really see at all what's going on. And he's now in kind of a wooded area too, so he can't, he just can tell that someone is there and that they're on a horse, and that's about it. And the other horseman keeps close to Ichabod, despite his efforts to try to get away. And at one point he tries to lag behind him, and then the horse lags as well. And so they basically the horseman is following Ichabod. So at first he's just kind of uneasy about it, and then this happens. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have been resting on his shoulders, was carried before him on this pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. So in their flight, Ichabod and his horse miss the road to Sleepy Hollow, and they take off down towards another valley that leads to the old Dutch church, which is still there in Sleepy Hollow to this day. But and then there's a bridge that crosses a small brook before entering the churchyard. And this is supposedly where the horseman disappeared on Brom Bones in his story. Just as Ichabod seems to be gaining some advantage on the horseman, the saddle comes undone from the horse and begins to slip and falls to the ground, and Ichabod hears it being trampled under the feet of the horse behind him. So he knows that the horseman is right behind him, and he says he even dares think that he felt the horse's hot breath on his back. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side. And now Ichabod cast a look behind, to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to a rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. So the saddle that slipped from the horse was the horse owner's Sunday saddle, as it said, so it was his nicest saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hoofs deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. So basically Ichabod has disappeared, and no one knows where he went to. They only find his hat and a shattered pumpkin on the road, and the saddle from the horse that he was on. Most people believe in the town that Ichabod was carried away by the headless horseman. Still, some others aren't so sure. One man actually claims to have gone up into a different town and met Ichabod, and he had become a politician and a lawyer, and now had a whole family. But it's stated that most people in Sleepy Hollow believe that he was spirited away by the headless horseman. There's one final telling sentence in here that might give us some insight into what actually happened to Ichabod. Brom Bones, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse being deserted soon fell to decay, and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue, and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy solemn tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. And that is the end of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's implied that Ichabod was pranked by Brom Bones in order to add insult to injury of his rejection from Katrina and scare him out of Sleepy Hollow entirely. Therefore, there would be no more competition for Brom. Then he could then go forth and marry Katrina, which is what happened. He did marry Katrina. So, was there really a headless horseman? The people of Sleepy Hollow seem to think so. I really like this story because it isn't a ghost story, really. I mean, it talks about the effects of superstition on the mind and how it plays tricks with you, and things that are perfectly normal and not going to hurt you can scare you half to death. It's honestly one of my favorite stories ever, and especially around this time of year. There's two main adaptations of it that are most popular, and that would be the 1949 Disney cartoon, which is actually extremely accurate to the story. It adds, obviously, Disney cartoon things like songs and things, but it's actually really accurate to the story, and it tells the story very well. I don't think it does the Headless Horseman scene right, because Hollywood can't help itself. It has to be a spectacular revelation. It can't be that subtle, slow burn like it is in the story. That's personally, to me, what makes that scene so good and terrifying. The other one is Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, which isn't really based on the story at all. It has the same characters and the same location and the idea of a headless horseman. Otherwise, it's a completely different story, but a really good one. I really love Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow. It's one of my favorite movies ever. It has the best atmosphere of any horror movie of all time. I don't know. Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow is a phenomenal film. It completely changes the character of Ichabod Crane. And there's a subtle hint to the original story, because there's a scene where Ichabod is trying to cross a bridge, and he hears a frog, and, he's kind of paranoid, and then the Headless Horseman comes for him and hits him in the head with a pumpkin and knocks him off his horse, but it turns out to have been Brom Bones, which might as well have been the story of Sleepy Hollow itself. So it's just contained in a 5-minute scene, but that is the story of Sleepy Hollow within that movie. But that movie is phenomenal, and I recommend that you watch it. This is a fantastic story. I thank you guys for watching this video. If you're still watching, thank you so much. I recommend that you read it for yourself, and I recommend that you watch the different movie adaptations of it. I know there are several, but the main two, like I said, are the Disney and that one. This is a great story for the fall. It really has a fall feeling to it. Not even necessarily a Halloween feeling, but certainly just this feeling of autumn. Otherwise, not much to talk about. My last video got tens of views, and I can't thank you guys enough. I thought I'd get more views, but whatever. Anyway, without further ado, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.